All right, my dear students, welcome to your Greek lesson for the day. I didn't want to leave you go without at least a few additional comments following on from our discussion yesterday towards the end of class about the Greek verb system. So yesterday we had basically an overview of the ancient Greek way of looking at verbs. And if you'll remember, there were three basic aspects to the verbs that we talked about, the first of them being tense. And of course, tense is important in English as well because we talk about time, right? Tense really has a lot to do with the time that something happens, although there are some other things to discuss in regards to that, all right? We also talked about the mood, all right, and I gave you the different moods. For instance, we had the indicative, we had subjunctive, there was optative, there was the infinitive, there was imperative. There were different moods, which we also have something similar in English, but we don't exactly describe it that way. English is very specific and very detailed about the mood a verb is in. And the third thing that we also discussed that's important in grammar is the idea of voice. So in English we have active voice, where the doer of the action is also the subject. We got passive voice, where the doer of the action is not the subject of the sentence, right? The receiver of the action is the subject. And Greek adds to those two things something known as middle voice, which tends to have the meaning when somebody is made to do an action, all right? And we'll come back to middle voice in greater detail later on. What's important for now, and the thing that I really want to focus on, is actually getting into one of the verbs. So we're going to start with the verb known as the imperfect, indicative, active. So imperfect here refers to the tense, and it specifically means here the past tense. It means the action has been done in the past and completed. The indicative refers to the mood, and it means something that is done that was completed in the real world. It actually happened. And finally, the active voice, meaning the subject of the sentence is the same as the doer. All right, so let's take a closer look at these verbs, how they're formed in Greek, how you can identify them, and I'll point out some other details. If you take a look in your Greek book, follow along under Lesson 7, Imperfect, Indicative, Active, skip over the things that White says, because a lot of this is going to become a little bit confusing for you. And whatever important things there are here, we'll come back to together. What I really want you to focus on is section 69, which is paradigms, and it breaks down and shows you exactly how to form a Greek verb in the imperfect, indicative, active. Right? What we have here in this chart, I'll explain this to you a little bit. We've got 4 columns. We've got a column for the verb luo. We've got a column for the verb bouluo. We have a column for the verb pempo. And we've got a column for the verb harpazdo. All right. You'll notice that each of the forms of the verb that come under each of those columns is different than what I said. And that's because Greek has a system of prefixes and suffixes that tell you the important information that you need to know to translate that verb. All right. Over here in this column, let me explain this to you a little bit. We've got the singular. All right, singular first person, second person, and third person. All right, so first person singular is I. Second person singular is you. Third person singular is he, she, or it. Right? Down below, we've got the familiar P for plural. First person plural being we. Second person plural being you. In English, we've stopped using this, but maybe down south we still have an echo of this when people say y'all. All right, that was part of Greek grammar, was the ability to say you plural. And finally, we got third person plural, which is they. In the middle here, between singular and plural, we've got, and I mentioned this very briefly before, but we've got dual number. So dual, you'll remember, is when you've got 2 of something. A lot of languages, for some reason, thought it was important to show when you have not only one or more than one, but specifically when you've got two of something. So notice here you've got dual second person. So that would indicate when it's you two or you both. And it also had third person dual, which meant those two or both of them. All right? All right. The first column here is a breakdown of the different conjugations of the verb luo. And in its root form, it's spelled lam, upsilon, omega. Look at what happens to this verb, though. Like, we'll take first person singular right here. What happens is the epsilon is brought in as a prefix. So one of the things that shows the imperfect indicative active is the epsilon prefix. Notice also what happens at the end of the verb. I said the original spelling was lam, upsilon, omega. The omega is gone. What happens is the omega drops out and the suffix is added to tell you the person. So omicron nu indicates first person singular. Epsilon sigma indicates second person singular. And simply epsilon indicates third person singular. In the dual, we've got omicron nu indicates second person dual. And epsilon tau eta nu indicates third person dual. For first person plural, it's omicron mu, epsilon nu. For second person plural, for y'all, it's epsilon tau epsilon. And finally, for third person plural, it's omicron nu. Now here's a question for you. How can you distinguish between third person plural and first person singular? The answer is, just like we do in English, you can distinguish between the two by context. A lot of our verbs, most of our verbs in English, share a common form, common endings. And so how do we figure out when somebody is talking about one person versus another? Well, we figure it out by the context, right? And that's exactly how the Greeks did it as well, right? So what you find across the board here is exactly the same forms, right? The same prefixes and suffixes for each of the persons and numbers, right? So we've got all the different forms here for luo. We've got the ones here for buluo, right? The meaning of, by the way, I should mention that. The meaning of luo it can mean a few different things. It can mean to loosen. It can mean to free. It could mean to break down or even destroy. Our word analyze is related to the word luo. The ly in analyze comes from the lam upsilon in luo. All right. Abuluon here comes from the verb buluo, which means to plan, or in keeping with a lot of our sort of military theme as we have various battles and tents and slings and whatnot in our sentences, you can imagine that plan here would be translated as strategize, perhaps if you're talking about an army. Epempon comes from the word pempo, the root form is pempo, meaning to send. And finally, harpazdon comes from the root harpazdo, which means to seize, to capture, or to plunder. All right. Your task here with this chart, what I would like you to do is in your notes, make yourself a chart that shows what prefixes and suffixes go with each person and number. All right, and have that handy, because what we'll do when I come back is I'll give you some verbs and I'll have you write out the imperfect, indicative, active conjugations for each of the persons and numbers. All right. Moving on here to page number 17. Again, skip over this a little bit. What we'll do is go right to section number 71 and take a look. They give you some of the words that we've had in the past. So you might want to take a look back and recall the translation for any of those words. And what I'll ask you to do here is to translate the meanings of each of these 10 words that are given here. All right. So how do you know what person is mentioned here? What's the subject of the sentence? You have to judge by the ending. So we have epsilon, tau, epsilon ending, all right, with the prefix epsilon. So we know that it's imperfect, indicative, active. The epsilon, tau, epsilon ending shows, if we go back to the chart, let's see, where do we see the epsilon, tau, epsilon ending? It would be here, under second person plural. All right. So the proper translation for eluete could be